So I'm going to go ahead and get started. First, I wanted to thank Bill and Jennifer for inviting me to come out here today. It's always fun to travel and see my hats set up in different exhibitions, and they're sort of like my babies. It's always exciting to come and visit them again in new places. So I'm really delighted to be here. One of the questions I always get when I talk about when people find out I have this hat collection is, how in the world did you get started? And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about how my collection has evolved and some of the things that I've been able to do with it. And for me, one of the adventures has also been in how I find some of these hats that I have, and that you'll see. But for me, becoming a hat collector, or as I call myself, a mitrologist, which is a word that I created. And I learned you can actually invent words yourself. So mitre is, I think, the Latin word for hat, or a particular type of hat. You know, think of a church hat that the Pope wears is called a mitre. Ologist is somebody who studies hats. Or study something. So it's really been, for me, a very unexpected journey. And it's been filled with surprises and lots of adventures along the way. And I think that's what's kept me at it for probably more than 40 years at this point. I've been collecting hats and adding very slowly to my collection. The collection really began with a 25-cent, very simple little skull cap that I bought in Turkey. And it grew slowly, but now I've really lost track because I haven't cataloged anything for a while. But I'd venture to say it's probably over 1,400 hats that I have in my collection from about 150 countries. Not all the hats are great hats or museum, worth being on display or in a museum, but I do lots of different programs. I work with kids. I've had them on display. In fact, I've had them on display in New York City for fashion shows and so forth. So I find having a wide variety of hats, and some hats that I don't care too much about how they get handled, is nice. So not all 1,400 hats are really great hats. But since I always am asked about how I started this collection, the real true answer is by mistake. I don't think of myself as being a collector in general, somebody who's out to acquire stuff. So it sort of surprises me that I have acquired and accumulated so much stuff. But after graduating from college, some family friends, a Spanish family that my family knew, invited me to live with them in Spain. They had an extra apartment that they bought as an investment, and they said, gee, why don't you come over? And I love to travel, and I love learning other languages, so I thought that this would be a great opportunity. So I arrived in this sleepy little town in Andalusia, Spain, and really intending to spend about maybe 4 months teaching myself as much Spanish as I could. And I went armed with dictionaries and workbooks and grammar books and so forth. I'd studied French in school but didn't know a word of Spanish. And I really intended to learn as much as possible. So every day I would pick an article, in addition to doing the workbooks and so forth, I'd pick an article in a newspaper or magazine and translate it word for word for word for word. And I must have been feeling lazy one day because the article I translated was a short advertisement in a magazine, and it turned out to be a man in Madrid who was looking for people to accompany him on a trip, an overland trip from Spain to India. So I had Frances, the woman of the house, call and get more information. At that point, my Spanish was, I think I'd been in Spain maybe a month, and really wasn't very good then. And she called, got some information, and about a week later, I set off on this trip. There was one space left when she had called, and I just sort of serendipitously said, yes, I'll go. I think it cost all of $400 for this, what was expected to be about a 4-month trip. So I set off in this school bus and in this Land Rover with a group of 23 Spaniards, none of whom I could really speak with. But there was this man Lorenzo had taken an old school bus and basically retrofitted it. They gutted the inside and set up wooden tables and chairs so that during the day we could, read and eat and whatever, be comfortable sitting on the bus. And then at night we'd pull over on some remote road, all pile out of the bus, and they would go in and put down platforms that sort of hung from the sides of the bus, almost bunk bed style, along both sides of the bus, and that's where we would sleep. So this was really a trip. We traveled like gypsies. This was not by any means some kind of a luxury thing. But it was really quite an adventure. So along the way, I did learn a lot of Spanish. I had to learn very quickly. I learned that when I got back to this little town and this family, that my Spanish was a lot of slang, and probably pretty bad slang at that. But anyway, I did learn it. But also, as we were traveling eastward, this is where, I think this is outside of, in Baluchistan, Pakistan, where the bus broke down. So probably a few weeks into this trip, we were stuck in this very remote little desert, I mean, in the middle of nowhere for a while. But anyway, it was a great group of people and lots of adventures, and we somehow always made it through. But it was really fascinating as we traveled eastward. We passed through lots of local communities, and it was fascinating to observe the differences in terms of the villages we passed through, the way people lived, and also, in particular, the kinds of clothing that people wore. So we arrived about a week later. Where is my cursor? In Istanbul. And we were parked somewhere, something I'm sure you could no longer do. We were parked in a main square in the center of Istanbul. And I remember waking up the first morning we were there and looking out of the windows of the bus and seeing really a sea of these skull caps, men with skull caps walking by the bus. And it turns out we were parked very close to the Sultanahmet Mosque, or also known as the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. And the reason I saw so many men with skull caps is they were all on their way to the mosque to say their morning prayers. And as one of the religious practices, the men had to have their head covered in order to enter into the mosque. And so I was really struck. This was back in the late 70s, and Americans, for the most part, had stopped wearing hats altogether. So to see all these men with colorful skull caps was really sort of a lot of fun and very alluring. It's like, oh my gosh, we really are far from home. So later that day, as I was exploring, I found a man outside of the mosque who was selling skull caps, and for 25 cents, I think, I bought my first hat. Very simple piece right there. It doesn't get much attention these days. And that's just a picture of the mosque. But for me, this little hat is really what started the collection. It was a perfect souvenir, and that's really how my collection started. And when I say by mistake, I never really intended to turn it into something. But it was inexpensive. It was very easy to pack. I could jam it just in a little corner of my backpack and make it disappear. But it was also very evocative of the cultures that I was experiencing. And as we traveled through parts of sort of Eastern Europe and Turkey and eastward, it was really remarkable to travel through these towns and see how something as simple and basic as a skull cap could change. So I know people who collect just skull caps because there's something sort of enchanting and fun about them. They come in all different shapes and colors and designs, embroidery and so forth. So I think from the bottom, I'll just read you where they are. Turkmenistan, I think either Pakistan or Bangladesh, I don't remember. Uzbekistan is the black one, Afghanistan, India, or it's called sort of referred to as a Nepali hat, and the one in the center, the tall one, is from Africa. So skull caps themselves have a lot of interest. The first time, though, that I realized that the hats might really have a lot of meaning or some underlying significance was on a trip to Peru. And I was traveling with a very small group of people, sort of haphazardly. We were in a van driving from Cusco into the rainforest in the Andes. And we passed through a village where it happened to be the marketplace that day. And all the people were, particularly the women, were dressed in their traditional costume. So big, heavy black skirts with lots of embroidery. And all the ladies were wearing these hats called a montera. And so as we were milling around the town and exploring, I found a man who had a stack of these monteras in front of him that he was selling. So I ended up buying one of my earlier acquisitions. One of the interesting things about these hats, they're worn, I'd say Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, which is where the Quechuan people live, they still wear a lot of their traditional costume. It's not uncommon at all to see the local women wearing this. So they're from the Andes, and the Quechuans are descendants of the Incas, the Inca civilization prior to the Spanish conquistadors arriving in that part of South America. But there are lots of different styles of monteras. They're generally of sort of an odd hat. They're very flat. They don't sort of cover your head. They almost sit on top of it. Most of them are round. Sometimes they're different shapes. But the history of these hats is sort of interesting. As I mentioned, the Inca were a very robust pre-Columbian civilization or empire in the Americas prior to Pizarro the Conquistador arriving and basically wiping them all out. But archaeologists have sort of speculated that this montera may have been a way for them to help, in face of all this adversity, to preserve their culture, because the montera, most of them are round, and if you look at the top of them, they have these sort of rays of sun coming out. The way they're just decorated, they have these rays. And the Inca people were sun worshippers. They worshipped a god named Inti, and they think that the hats might relate to their sun worshipping practices and sort of represent the sun and their god. One of the other interesting, so to me it has an interesting history and helps give some insight into that particular era. But I also learned through personal experience that the hats have, in many areas, a more significant meaning as well. And that in some villages, including the one that I happened to buy one of my first hats at, the fringe of the hat can indicate a woman's marital status. And so when we stopped in this little village, and I happened to find one of these hats, I bought a hat down here at the bottom with a yellow fringe on it. And as I was making my way back to where our van was parked and I was rejoining this group of people, I noticed that there were several local women who were following me. And one finally approached me and was sort of curious about this hat that I bought. And I've discovered, too, that when I travel and I start asking questions about local headwear and really authentic pieces, people really sort of perk up and go, oh, I think it's an unusual thing for most tourists to be interested, to have an interest in. And so people really respond to that. So it's also a way, if you ever travel or start looking for a hat, it's a really nice way to open doors in a community. But anyway, this woman who finally nerved herself up to come over and talk to me kept asking me where my husband was. And I was young, single at the time, wasn't traveling with anybody. And I'm like, no husband, no husband. And she kept pointing to the hat. And that's when I realized that only a woman, in that particular village, only women who were married would wear a hat with a yellow fringe on it. And what I should have done, according to their customs, was buy a hat with a red fringe, and that would have indicated my status as a single unmarried woman. And I'm sure one of them would have, rushed home to find a son to introduce me to or something like that. So good thing I bought the hat with the yellow fringe. But anyway, it was really an eye-opening experience. It was just kind of fun. And I had no idea that something as simple as a hat could have that kind of significance. So you've seen the first hat that I bought, but I also get questions about my favorite hat. And of course, that's a sort of a tough question, but I'd say this one on the screen here is one of my very favorites. It's a hat from a former headhunting tribe in Indonesia. And I love it because, it was just by chance I happened to find this in a flea market in Chiang Mai, Thailand. But I love the variety. The base of it is made out of some kind of woven straw. So it looks like sort of shaped and formed as a basket. It's covered with some odd pieces of cloth in the back. It has these tufts of goat hair coming out of the sides. It has this really delicate panel of beadwork in the front, and it's topped with hornbill feathers. So, it's got a mix of all kinds of crazy decorative features on it. That's a hornbill in the middle, which is in the Dayak, among many of these tribal groups. This is both true in African and parts of Asia. The hornbill sort of considered a very magical and powerful bird. But the man on I guess it's to your left, like you can see the guy there in his hat. So my husband and I, he had a business trip in Malaysia, and we decided to take the time and go and visit Borneo. So this man was from the Dayak community, and the Dayak is sort of an overarching term that includes a number of different tribal groups and communities. And he was a resident of a longhouse, which is the traditional communal living space that these tribes would live in. And so we were visiting this longhouse in Sarawak, Indonesia. And I thought, well, here's an opportunity for me to find a little bit more about this hat. So I asked him about it. And I think at that point I came better prepared when I was traveling and had pictures of the hats that I wanted to buy and so forth. So I showed him a picture of my hat. And he's like, okay, wait a minute. And he goes into this little door with a lock and a key and drags out a box, opens it up, and pulls out his hat to show me. So I was thrilled. It's like, he has a hat like mine. I actually think mine's nicer. I think it's older and has more delicate beadwork on it. But anyway, it was an opportunity for me to ask him some questions. And I knew that hornbills were very important. And I'd sort of assumed, in lieu of other good information, that the hornbill feathers might have been a way of indicating how many heads a man had taken. And he's like, no, that's just, that's sort of more of a decoration. Yeah, they have to be earned. Not anybody could have them. But the way you tell a real headhunter, a successful one, is by the number of tattoos on his knuckles. And he holds up his hand, and his knuckles are all tattooed. A real headhunter.
Excuse me, what island were you on in Indonesia?
I think this was Sarawak.
Okay. That's the name of the island?
I'm sorry?
That's the name of the island?
Yeah, no, Borneo was the island. Sarawak, I'm trying to think of the other names. So the island of Borneo is part owned by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, the Kingdom of Brunei. Sarawak is just a town on one of the coasts there. So I said that hat collecting has been sort of an unexpected adventure. I've also gotten to know and become friends with other hat enthusiasts around the world, thanks to things like Facebook and other social media sites. So I have a whole community of people, and we share hats. And if somebody's looking for a hat when they're traveling, they're all nice enough to bring one back. But about 6 years ago, a Dutch woman contacted me. This was really before we did a lot on Facebook, I think. This Dutch woman, Monique, contacted me asking for some advice and assistance on a book that she was writing about children's hats. And we became friends over Facebook, and a year after her first contacting me, and we'd never met each other, we just corresponded, we decided to travel together to Vietnam. We were both interested in visiting this remote part of northern Vietnam, where there are a lot of different tribal communities. And we organized this trip. We met at the airport in Hanoi in Vietnam, sort of looking for each other since we'd never met and didn't know how we'd meet up. We had arranged for a guide and so forth. But we ended up spending a couple weeks visiting these really remote tribes in these mountainous areas. And it's an area of North Vietnam, north of a town near Sapa, and very, very close to the Chinese border. But the people there are lots of different tribes, and they really have a spectacular variety of head coverings. So this was just a picture of some of the different tribes. There's a woman from the Red Dao community. I think that was also Red Dao. Hmong is another community. Hani is a young girl with a hat with all the decorations. And man, I really wanted to buy that hat on the lower left from this lady. I'd never seen one like it. She wouldn't sell it. I think it was, the Dao is one of the tribes, and I think there are lots of different sort of smaller communities within that. But anyway, it was, lots of fun things to see in the marketplace there. One of my most surprising connections came while I was researching a gourd hat that I had bought it was from the Philippines. I bought it years ago. It had been a piece that had been in my collection for a while. And I wanted to include it in the Global Headwear exhibition. But I wasn't able to find much information on this hat. I knew it was a gourd, I knew it was from the Philippines, and it's like I just wanted more information about how it was made, whether or not it had any sort of social significance or any particular meaning. So I kept going into the internet and looking, and I'm pretty good at researching obscure things like weird hats. But anyway, I couldn't find much about this hat, but I did often come across an article that had been written about a man named Teofilo Garcia. And he makes these gourd hats somewhere in one of the northern islands. Luzon, I think, is the name of the island in the Philippines. And I found quite a few references to this man who had been named as a national living treasure in the Philippines. And a national living treasure is I think originally it was a UNESCO designation. For encouraging countries to keep alive their traditional handicrafts and workmanship and so forth. But the Philippines were very proud of this man, and I saw these articles. So finally, as I'm digging around, I found an article that happened to have the author, the journalist's byline and email address. So, finally, maybe I'll get a little bit closer to figuring out where I can get more information about this hat. And so I wrote to this author, the writer, Esteban was his name, sent him an email introducing myself, telling him I was organizing an exhibition of hats from around the world, and I wondered if he had any idea on how I might contact this man, Teofilo Garcia. So he writes back immediately. There's a 12-hour time difference, so it was probably midnight. I'm about to shut off my computer, and I get a response back immediately because it's daytime in the Philippines. And he says, yes, contact George Leyland on Facebook. I'm like, okay, so I find George Leyland on Facebook, put out a friend request, turn off the computer, go to sleep, and the next morning, I have all this information from this guy, George, who I've never met or corresponded with at all. And anyway, so he had, this man had gotten in touch with George. It must be a very small community. Everybody seems to know each other. And I had about all these messages, just from overnight, from George saying he'd already put in an order for this particular gourd hat for me. And I'm thinking, this is just amazing. And he gave me regular updates. So here's a picture of these big calabash gourds that he collects, sets out in the sun to dry. That's one of the hats. And he puts I don't know exactly what the workmanship is, but a very delicate brim on it. He cleans it up, polishes it and shines it and so forth. And so I got regular updates on the progress of my hat. And I could tell people in this community were very, very excited about, some American lady wanting one of this man's hats. So here's Teofilo signing the hat, and this is a hat. So I actually now have two gourd hats in the exhibit. One was already there, and then I felt an obligation to include this one. So this is the one with the signature on it. But once the hat was completed, I had to figure out how George was going to send this to me. So this man has been so incredibly nice. He did some research, went around to figure out shipping costs, and it was going to cost probably 5 times what the cost of the hat was. I think I paid them $60 for this hat, and it was about $300 to ship it, because it's quite big and bulky. And I'm like, oh boy, that doesn't sound like a great equation. So he said, let me put it out on social media and see if I know anybody. I guess there are a lot of people from his remote island in the Philippines who travel, or there are lots of Filipinos who live abroad in the US and Canada. So he reached out, and sure enough, he found this woman, Jo V, who raised her hand, volunteered her mother, who was coming to visit her in Canada, where she lives. She just had her first child, and her mother was coming over to Canada for the first time. And I said, New York or Toronto, I live in Rochester, New York, so Toronto's actually closer and easier for me to get to than New York City. So this seemed perfect. And this woman, I'm not very tall. You can see I tower over this little lady who, in this shopping bag filled with stuff, delivered this hat to me. And so I was in touch with her daughter, Jo V, and we arranged a time for me to come pick it up, this hat up in Toronto. And I arrived in their little apartment, and it was a big celebration of friends and family. I mean, they were sort of honoring. I drove up with my husband and a couple friends, and they had friends, and her family was there, and there was this big celebration in this feast that they had. And I mean, it was just so heartwarming to see how welcoming they were. And you know, I didn't know what, I think I brought them some chocolate and some other little gifts for doing this, but the idea of carrying this big bulky thing halfway around the world on a plane was just extraordinarily nice to me. So it's really been wonderful that people halfway around the world have just been so open, and makes you realize how good people are everywhere. So here I was on my own little personal mission, and it just opened up all these really wonderful doors for me. So as a collector, I've really enjoyed the adventures and all the connections that I've been able to make with people around the world. And when you see the hats and headdresses on display, hopefully you'll be impressed by all the different shapes, the styles, the designs. You know, I look at some of these things and, you know, you're sort of limited. It's just going on your head. But it's, to me, remarkable how creative people can be, you know, in terms of making some of these hats, the way they're designed, the different styles, the decorations they use. You know, everywhere around the world, there are just enormous variations. But I think also in terms of the differences, what has fascinated me about the hats is that if you dig a little bit deeper and you really understand why the hats are worn, and not just focusing on the way they're all different, you begin to realize that the hats really represent something about us that makes us all human, that we really all wear hats for many of the same purposes. Or we have something in our wardrobes, for instance, that you know, we don't wear hats very often, but we do have other ways of sort of showing where we fit into our community, who we are, what we value, what religion we are, for instance. And as you look at the exhibition and see the hats and the way I've organized it in different themes, I think it's a way of reinforcing that in spite of the, you know, the overt differences, that there's a lot more that really brings us together and that we should have in common with people around the world. So that's all. I'm happy to answer any questions. I like my acorn hat there. This is like the most perfect little thing, so thank you very much. Yes?
How many countries do you have hats from?
I think about 150. Not all, I haven't traveled, I travel a lot. I haven't been to all the countries that I bought hats from. I started buying hats, you know, probably in the late 90s when eBay became a thing online. That was one of the few places that really, that opened up a lot of doors. There were lots of, you know, people who had shops selling tribal art stuff who were putting things out on, you know, on online auctions. Online auctions now are the place to really look around.
A lot cheaper than going to the place. Although,
But not near, well, sort of, depending on where you go. When you factor in the cost of getting, you know, factor in Western prices for something that you might buy and, you know, other people are bidding on something at an auction versus just traveling to, I don't know, India. I just got back from India a couple months ago, where the prices are much more affordable. That's the argument I always make when I want to go somewhere. It's like, well, I could just go there and buy it myself.
Do you have antique hats from, like, I mean, my grandmother had hat boxes stacked in her.
Oh, yeah. Well, my collection started off as contemporary hats. So that's mostly what I focused on. I do have some older pieces, and I have a few older pieces in the exhibition. When I started, well, I did not intend, I mean, there were souvenirs and they were just kind of interesting things. I didn't intend to build a collection, nor could I really afford to at that point. So it was easier to just buy contemporary pieces. So now it's expanded.
You don't have any with birds on them.
I do. Ooh, I have one with a hornbill head. I sort of avoid skulls and so
that's
forth.
also like- I'm not
Yeah.
talking about
Beautiful, like ladies' fashion hats with
Yeah.
a couple. I do. I've had people, for a while, everybody wanted to give me like their grandmothers or their aunts' old fashion hats. And I have quite a few of those. That's a whole nother thing in terms of researching them and storing them and so forth. So I have some.
That's a good question right over here.
Yes.
Keep all your hats.
Oh, yeah, another question I always get. Well, we live in so they're pretty well stored. I've turned the guest room into a hat storage area, and I have on one wall sort of stacking racks, and most of the hats are in plastic boxes that are now lined with muslin or acid-free types of, museum quality paper. Not ideal, but it's, not a bad start. And so I have in that rack hats organized by geography and basically anything that I can sort of fold relatively flat. So a lot of things there. Everything under the bed is, sort of taken. We do have, so we live in a pretty big house in Rochester, and it was curious because there are these big sort of loft areas above the dining room and just in the hallway. I have no idea what they're there for or what anybody would use them for display, but they are perfect. They are absolutely perfect. And one ceiling sort of slopes down like that so I can put tall hats and sort of scatter them. So I mean, that's ideal. And so I probably have about 125 hats on display around the house. But then with the big bulky hats, after I moved, I've been in Rochester about 20 years. When I'd hear of a store going out of business, I would go down and negotiate for display cases from stores and bring them there. And so the basement is filled with display cases. It's not particularly pretty, but it protects them. It's got, it's a nice place. People often come over and want to see the hat. So I have a little display area for big bulky things that, don't lie down in smaller boxes. So they're all over.
Charge admission fee.
Well, I'm thinking for myself too in traveling, and if these hats have a spiritual, religious significance to that culture, I'm even thinking of your first skull cap. Have you run across any instances where it was kind of frowned upon or sacrilegious for you to purchase them or wear them or whatever? I'm just curious, running into anything like that.
I have run into that. I've had a couple instances where people don't want to sell me a hat. I had bought a couple Tibetan monks' hats at a store in New York City, and I had to go in several times. So the proprietor of the store in New York is very closely connected to the Tibetan community and the Tibet House in New York City. So he has, and there's a pretty large Tibetan community and, monks and so forth in the city. So he had good connections, and I think the monks went to him to buy their headgear and traditional clothing. So I had to sort of work and soften him up before he'd sell me some of the monks' hats and just explain to him why I wanted them. There's a hat on display from Bhutan, another Tibetan monk's hat called a black hat. It's used in a very important ceremony called the Black Hat Dance. And I was in Bhutan. I knew I was looking for something like that. Couldn't find it because it wasn't at that point being performed. We were there in a time of year where it wasn't being performed in any of the monasteries. But I found that generally if you go into a monastery, for instance, you can't buy any hats. But they do have religious supply stores, just the way we do in this country. And so two hats I bought at religious supply stores. Both a little bit reluctant to sell them to me, but I did manage to get them. So one is the Black Hat Dance hat, and the other one is the, I think it's called a kanmuri, the Japanese Shinto hat. That was kind of a tough negotiation. I mean, it was just even tough to get the guy to take me to a religious supply store, but that's I've sort of discovered is a pretty good source.
question.
Yes.
Because I was with the display on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
There's a cat, I believe it's from Congo. It's in the room with Prestige, and
Uh-huh.
it has got buttons all over it. And I had something,
Oh.
why would they do, now some of the buttons were obviously shell, but the one I said, I've got a bunch of those in my sunglasses.
Yep.
And I thought it was kind of unusual because a lot of them had shells and beads, and these looked like buttons you could go buy at Joann's or something.
You probably could.
And I just wonder, is there a significance to that? The rest of it was elephant hair. which
Yep,
is
I know
very
exactly what hat
traditional.
you're speaking of. It's not uncommon to see hats from that area with buttons on them. I think, the buttons are sort of shiny, they're uniform shapes, they
Right.
sort of fill in as cowrie shells in a way. So I think I don't think they have any particular significance. I think they're just sort of a decorative piece. I have a hat from Pakistan, a child's hat that it's a very small skull cap, and it has a little piece of a zipper around the bottom of it. And it's just, I think they're just odds and ends, things that we would consider sort of odds and ends that might be in a sewing bin that they'll look at and go, oh, this is kind of nice and maybe sparkly and, a little bit different, and use it as part of a decoration on a hat.
Okay, I know the 20th century, so.
Yeah.
George?
I know gender is kind of a tricky question these days for a variety of reasons, but do you have any observations on men wearing hats versus women wearing hats?
Not really. I think men wear more wear more hats than women do these days because baseball caps. It really is fairly rare to see a woman wearing a hat, unless in the sun. I think more and more women are conscious of the sun and will wear a hat when they go out. But the baseball hats is something that I do notice, and I talk about them because baseball hats can reveal a lot about who you are, where you come from, just the way hats in the exhibit do. You can look at a hat and go, oh yeah, that's worn by such and such community. Baseball hats sort of send a lot of meaning.
Worldwide, whether you're seeing
Worldwide?
differences in blind people.
No, except that men everywhere around the world are wearing baseball caps. This may not be actually getting to your particular question, and I should have brought this with me, but there was I was a number of years ago in Hanoi in Vietnam, and was walking down the street. I was with my mother. We'd stopped in a little shop, gotten a Coca-Cola, a can of Coke, Coke, and walked farther down the block, and there was a man who had turned these cans of Coca-Cola into baseball caps. He'd flattened out the metal piece and fashioned it into a baseball cap. And I bought one. I mean, it cost nothing, but it's really got a lot of meaning. Think of the antagonism we had with Vietnam for many years, and here they've taken two of the most iconic things in the United States, Coca-Cola and baseball caps, and combine them into one thing. So I love to hold it up in presentations and go, so what do you think about this one? You see men everywhere around the world wearing baseball caps. I think tourists like to leave them with people. But in general, I don't see a whole lot. Other than skull caps, you see a lot of men wearing skull caps in Muslim countries. You don't see women wearing hats too much.
Marcia, do you have a question?
Yes, do you have any headwear from the Native Americans?
Good question. A couple pieces. I don't know if you put the Native American piece. So I had,
Yes.
you do, so it is. So I have a Native American war bonnet sort of from the Lakota tribe. It is not an authentic piece, but I wanted to include it in the exhibition because it has a lot of meaning. It just sort of, raised a lot of questions about, it's a significant piece in the Native American community, and I wanted to include some things from our cultures as well.
When you say it's not authentic, you mean it was made for tourist trade
I
as opposed to being, but
It was made in a very authentic way, but yes, it wasn't something that was used, or I don't know who made it.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think maybe a Native American did make it, but not necessarily because it's made in pretty.
From the Native Americans?
It's what?
Did you buy it from a Native?
No, I bought it from a store in Idaho.
Trading
Um,
post? No,
I don't think it's even there anymore. I don't remember.
not a trading post.
No, no.
Might give it some authenticity.
But yeah, well, and I've investigated that a little bit. So I don't think it's, I mean, it's a little hard to say what's authentic. But and you know, it's an important hat in the Native American community, in the Lakota community. It has a lot of meaning, and I wanted to make sort of that parallel thing. And then I do have another hat that was bought in a pueblo in Santa Fe. It was bought at a store, sort of a trading post. Again, they no longer sell these things, but this was at a time when they did sell the things that they were wearing. So not nearly, you know, Native American things just go for so much money. It's, you know, that's almost a whole nother, I'm competing with people whose collections include nothing but that. So sadly, I don't have too much. Yeah.
Of the hats that you have and the approximate 150 countries that you've been to, can you guess the percentage of how many of those hats you bought in the countries? Or
Yeah, I actually knew that for a while. I want to say about 50% of the hats I bought in the countries that I've traveled to. Africa, I've been to Africa, have a couple things, but most of the African pieces I did not buy in Africa. For instance, I mean, that's one place where it's just hard to get good pieces in Africa. There seem to be other sources for that.
Like eBay and that kind of thing?
eBay, yeah. I'm trying to think. There were places in New York for a while. Yeah, that would import things.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your personal background, not just necessarily what drew you to hats, but you're obviously a well-traveled person. You're really into these different cultures around the world. What did you study in school, and what you know?
Nothing related to what I'm doing now. Well, I studied. So I've always been interested. So with my father worked for American Express, so we traveled probably more than most people did when we were growing up. It wasn't something we did all the time, but my parents always had an interest in traveling, so that certainly has rubbed off on both me and my sister. And in terms of studying, I studied, what did I study? Political science and psychology in school. I did study, started off at a sort of an experimental college where you could put together your own major, and I was interested in the connection between sort of politics and culture, and how a different cultural mores within a society allow certain political systems to develop successfully. I didn't really pursue that. Then I got, after college and living in Spain for a little while, I got a job in marketing research. That was a little boring and very tedious, looking at all these numbers. And I worked at AT&T. Before moving up to Rochester, worked at AT&T in marketing. And a variety of other things. AT&T was actually a fun company.
You're not a museum professional.
I'm not a museum professional.
That's kind of where
I've
I was
learned
gonna
a
finally get around
lot.
to, because I think that it's inspiring to everybody to
Mm-hmm.
see, no matter what your career path or your application in life is, that if you dedicate your time and resources toward a special area
Yeah.
that you're passionate about,
Uh-huh.
you too can have a traveling exhibition going around the country of
Yeah,
representing
you
that.
could.
And so
Uh-huh.
how did the exhibition company and you come together?
Well, I had, as I said, I've always been interested in traveling, so I sort of had this thing. I honestly never dreamed that I would be doing anything with my hats. This is the second traveling exhibition I've done. The first one I did I was probably almost 30 years ago that I started organizing it. And it was with a company in Kansas City. So I was still with AT&T, working remotely. This is before it became a common thing. And somebody in Kansas City put me in touch with a company that works with collectors and museums and will organize a traveling exhibition. And I just on a whim met with them and they said, sure, do you want to do this? So that's when I started collecting. I was like, oh my gosh, I just signed a contract. I don't really have enough hats here to go and travel. And so that's when I really became serious about learning more about them and building the collection. That was a successful exhibition, but the quality of the hats was not great. It was what I had, and so it did pretty well. But I really built up. So the money that I made from that first one, I invested in more hats and better hats.
Like every good
Yeah, right. And so I just decided it was time. I'd done a lot of research. I'd actually organized. I've been hiring museum studies students from RIT, a local university where they have a museum studies program. And so they've been a wonderful resource, both in terms of me, them sharing their knowledge and me, they've learned a lot about geography and cultural things and so forth. So that's been a really fun collaboration. And I just decided I wanted to do something again with the hats and investigated a couple different companies. They're not a whole lot that I'm aware of, of companies that work with museums to tour an exhibition. International Arts and Artists, who I've been working with, they're located in Washington, D.C., and they have a focus on sort of international collaboration, and so they seemed like a good match, and I wrote them a proposal and sent them some pictures, and they were interested, and here I am. I did. So yeah, it all comes together in the end.
This is fantastic.
So it's been fun. I feel very fortunate to be able to do what I'm doing. So yeah.
Well, we
I
thank
no
you
longer
for-
work in
for
marketing.
sharing them
Well,
with
thank you
us
very
with
much.
Elkhart and with
Thanks.